I'm happy to introduce Graham Buck, who's going to talk to us about the tallgrass prairie plants. You remember last year, we had Rare come and talk to us about the establishment of their tallgrass prairie, but they didn't have a lot of information about the actual plants. So we'll be happy to have Graham talk about that. Graham's interest in tallgrass prairie began in the summer of 1994 during a trip to southern Manitoba and Minnesota. Later that year, back in Ontario, Graham received a report on the prairies and savannas of southern Ontario and set out to visit as many of the remnants as possible. This occupied much of his time from 1994 to 2001 and led to the discovery of 2 new plant species for Ontario hidden in savanna remnants. From 2001 to 2005, while working with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, Graham's interest in prairie and savanna turned to preservation and recovery, and this continued after 2005 while working for the Brent Stewardship Network and Tallgrass Ontario. During this time, he became a government certified burn boss and completed numerous prescribed burns on private land. Graham's interest in prescribed burning on private land followed him when he started a career as a biologist with the Ontario government, and it continued until the stewardship program was cancelled. Graham has continued to assist Tallgrass Ontario with grants and restoration projects to recover Ontario's endangered tallgrass species until stepping back from the organization only recently. He now devotes most of his time to his family who live in Guelph. He is currently volunteering with the city of Guelph to naturalize a park near his home with native plants he grows in his backyard. Graham is also assisting with an update of the flora of Wellington County by searching for and documenting new species for the county. So welcome, Graham.
Okay, thank you, Judy. I'm just going to start sharing my screen, opening my presentation.
It looks good.
Okay, so as Judy mentioned, I'm here today to talk to you about the ecosystem and the plants of tallgrass prairie in Ontario, which is something I've been very passionate about for much of the time I've spent outside of university. I came to Guelph in 1990, both the city and the university, and it's been my home for most of the time ever since, although I have lived in a few surrounding areas of Fergus and London. And as Judy mentioned, I'm currently living in Guelph with my family. But what I hope to cover today is a little bit more information on the plants of tallgrass prairie. I was asked to sort of piggyback on the talk that Rare gave, where it introduced the ecosystem, but there wasn't as much information on the plants. So this talk is going to have a little bit about the ecosystem, and most of the time will be spent looking at the plants. So the first slide I'm bringing up is a map of southern Ontario from sort of Windsor up to towards Owenda Provincial Park and east towards Peterborough and the Rice Lake Plains. And what this figures from Tallgrass Ontario, and each of the red dots on the map symbolizes a tallgrass prairie or Oak Savannah remnant. And it really, you know, what it's intending to show is that although widespread throughout southern Ontario, tallgrass prairie and savanna ecosystems were still relatively rare, even at the time of European contact. However, the best we've been able to estimate is that in Ontario there was about 100,000 hectares of tallgrass prairie and oak savanna at the time of European contact, and probably around 2.5% of that original coverage exists in remnant form today. Throughout North America, as an ecosystem, tallgrass prairie it exists in about 1% of the form it covered pre-European contact. Also in Ontario, There's about 250 species of plants documented in prairies and savannas, and 20% of Ontario's rare plants are in prairie and savanna ecosystems. So they do contribute a fair amount to the Carolinian and Southern Ontario biodiversity. So the extent of tallgrass prairie in North America, including Ontario, is largely been driven by First Nations people. First Nations people used fire as a way of influencing the ecology on a massive scale. Fires were lit for numerous purposes, including to drive game animals for hunting, to facilitate easier travel, to increase yields of food plants. So these were hunter and gatherer societies that realized that certain food plants they gathered, medicine plants, etc., did better following prescribed burning. They used fire to clear land, both for agriculture or establishing new villages. And lastly, they used fire in battle, both as an offense and a defensive tactic. So as a result, fires were lit at many different times of year, spring, summer, and fall, and vast areas of eastern North America burned on a pretty frequent basis. I'm talking to you today about tallgrass prairie, but it's hard to not talk about tallgrass prairie without also mentioning Oak Savannah and Oak Woodland. And these ecosystems occurred as a mosaic on the landscape. They changed their coverage through time and space based on fire frequency, drought, and herbivory caused by both insect and mammals. We're largely focused today on tallgrass prairie, which is an open grassland ecosystem defined as having 0 to 10% canopy cover. So it can have a few scattered trees, but for the most part, it's an open grassland dominated ecosystem. On the fringes of tallgrass prairie, sort of as an ecotone between forest and woodland, is Oak Savannah, which is easiest to think of as a tallgrass prairie with a few more trees growing on it. Now we're up to 11 to 35% canopy cover, so still a very open habitat. And as an ecotone between Oak Savannah and forest is Oak Woodland, which is an open forest dominated by oaks, hickories, and pines, and has a canopy cover of 36 to 60%. Once you get above 60%, you're into traditional, what we think of as forest. So your sugar maple beech forest is canopy cover above 60%. So we're largely talking today about tallgrass prairie. And you can't talk about tallgrass prairie without talking about the grasses, because they are first and foremost the main driver of the ecosystem. They're the dominant biomass of mature and semi-mature tallgrass prairies. So prairie grasses are both fire and drought tolerant. This is primarily due to an extensive and deep root system. It's been estimated that 65% of the prairie's biomass occurs underground in these root systems. Tallgrass prairie grasses are most commonly warm season, or as is sometimes referred to as C4 grasses, whereas Eurasian grasses are predominantly cold season grasses and what is known in plant physiology as a C3 grass. Tallgrass prairie grasses are excellent at carbon sequestration. This is due to a very large surface area which is exposed to the sun and the extensive root system, which is very efficient at moving carbon from the atmosphere deep underground, where it is stored and built up over time. And tallgrass prairie makes excellent habitat for wildlife because they provide year-round food and cover. So moving into the plants of tallgrass prairie, first I'm going to talk about dry tallgrass prairie in southern Ontario. Dry tallgrass prairie, one of the dominant species in dry tallgrass prairie is big blue stem grass. This is a tall grass, 1 to 3 meters tall at maturity. It has a large seed head shaped like a turkey foot and prefers dry soils. Another common grass in dry tallgrass prairies is the shorter cousin of big blue stem grass, which is little blue stem grass. It may only grow up to 1 meter tall or less. It's a very attractive grass, as you can see from this picture, both due to the rich color and the downy seeds that it gets in the fall. And it requires very dry soil. Less common is the Canada Wild Rye, shown here. It has a bluish cast and beautiful arching seed heads with these long awns coming off the flowers and fruits. It prefers to grow in dry and rocky soils. Next is Indian grass, which is similar in height to big blue stem in the 1 to 3 meter range. However, it has a rust colored and fluffy seed head as opposed to the more open turkey foot seed head or flower head of the big blue stem. And it prefers to grow in dry sand and gravel soils. So just a little bit about where dry prairie occurs in Ontario. It occurs in areas of deep sand or gravel and can be found in physiographic regions such as the Norfolk Sand Plain, which is in Norfolk County and southern Brant County. The Bothwell Sand Plain, which is over in Middlesex County. The Rice Lake Plains, which is in eastern Ontario, east of Peterborough. It's also found in the Paris Gulf Moraine, but only in the Brant and Waterloo portions of that moraine. There was historically no prairie and savanna known from Pushlands Township, although there's some indication that it may have occurred in the extreme southern portion of Pushlands, but this hasn't been officially documented. Much of what we know about the historical extent of tallgrass prairie comes from early survey records, where as the lots and concessions were being mapped, the early surveyors described the vegetation that they encountered. And when they came to these areas of prairie and savanna, they were noted in their survey records as oak plains, oak chestnut plains, or just plains. So those survey notes are very detailed, and when overlaid with the physiographic mapping, which accompanied them later on, we got a fairly good historical extent of prairie and savanna in southern Ontario pre-settlement. So one of the main species of dry tallgrass prairie in southern Ontario is your butterfly milkweed. Interestingly enough, there are spotty records of butterfly milkweed in dry and gravelly areas outside of the tallgrass prairie range, including a record from 1920 from the University of Guelph. So we know that butterfly milkweed did occur in Guelph and in Wellington County, although it's been extirpated, and it was probably always extremely rare, being largely a tallgrass prairie species that may have slightly increased its range during settlement when forests were cleared and new lands were opened up. Many of you are familiar with it from your gardens or from gardens such as at the University of Guelph Arboretum. It's described as a bushy perennial with flat-topped clusters of bright orange and occasionally yellow flowers. I've never seen yellow flowered butterfly milkweed or butterfly weed in cultivation, but I have seen it in the wild. Interestingly enough, unlike other milkweeds, the leaves are mostly alternate as opposed to opposite, are long, pointed, and smooth, and the plant has no milky sap. So it's a very different milkweed from what we think of as milkweed or common milkweed. Another plant which is at home in dry tallgrass prairies, but also in dry meadows as well, is Hoya Vervain. It's a hairy stem perennial. It has what's called a terminal cluster, which is made up of a narrow flowering spike with very small lavender flowers growing in a ring around the spike. Although the flowers are small, the cluster of them actually does stand out really nicely, and it flowers typically in late summer. Another plant which is at home in dry tallgrass prairies, but which is also found in dry meadows as well, including dry meadows in and around Guelph, is wild bergamot. Many of you may be familiar with it, seeing it in meadows in Guelph. It is also frequently planted in naturalizations by the city. It's a medium-sized bushy plant with erect branches. The leaves are long and lance-shaped and tooth margins, and it's very fragrant, has a very strong minty odor, which is detected as soon as you're in the presence of this plant, and certainly when you crush the leaves. And the compact flower clusters are solitary at the ends of the branches. And each cluster is made up of 20 to 50 individual flowers, which kind of occur in a ring pointing outwards. And this species, like the similar red bee balm, is frequently pollinated by hummingbirds and insects with a long tongue. Showy tick trefoil is a legume. It has pea flowers which occur at the apex of the stem, and it has these, I guess some would say, annoying seed pods which stick to animal fur or clothing, like ticks, which gives it its name, tick trefoil. So trefoil is just a fancy way of saying 3 leaves, and tick is in reference to the seeds. So there's no association with ticks, but the seeds certainly stick to your clothing and to your dog for much the same way. Very annoying in the fall to accidentally encounter this species in a planting or in a tallgrass prairie remnant, and then have to spend the next half hour to an hour scraping the seeds off your shoes, socks, pants, shirt with a credit card. Prairie Smoke. This one's kind of interesting. The botanists in the group maybe more familiar with this species primarily in alvars, such as the Carden alvar up near Aurelia. However, historically, in the Waterloo, Brant, Norfolk area, the Paris Gulf moraine and associated similar Norfolk sandplain had vast areas of prairie smoke growing in dry prairie remnants. However, unfortunately, most of these populations have been lost to agriculture and later on to the growth of cities such as Cambridge and to the widening of roads. But it's interesting to think that prairie smoke actually once occurred commonly in the prairies of southern Ontario, the dry prairie remnants, particularly the ones in the areas of Cambridge and Brantford. The name prairie smoke is in reference to the seed head pictured here, which have long beard-like awns. This is a fairly early spring flowering plant with three flowers in a cluster, and the leaflets are compound with 9 to 19 narrow tooth leaflets, and the plant grows spreads both by seed and vegetatively by underground rhizomes. Here's another mint, which similar to the one we met previously, the wild bergamot, has a strong minty smell when you're in the presence of this plant. This is Virginia mountain mint. It has these clusters of small white flowers, which a few open at a time, so it does have a fairly prolonged blooming time with just a few flowers in the cluster open at a time. It's a relatively small to medium-sized plant, maybe reaching a maximum of 1 meter in height, and it has kind of this whitish, hairy stem and leaves, which gives it a bit of a silver cast to it. This is flowering spurge. I think some people call this the baby's breath of the prairie due to its similar appearance to the cut flower baby's breath, which is in flower arrangements. It has minute flowers, which are surrounded by 5 round white petal-like bracts. So these actually aren't petals, flower petals, but bracts, and the flowers are actually minute and found in the center of the cluster. So it produces these sort of flowers, the flower mimics, and this is common in a number of plant species, especially in the spurge family. Vegetatively, it has a whorl of smooth, bright green leaves, which surround the stem at the point where 3 to 7 flowering stalks start to branch off. So that's shown in this picture here, where we have 5 flowering stalks emerging from a whorl of 5 leaves. And similar to the Virginia mountain mint, this plant grows to 1 meter in height. And like many of our spurges, the flowering spurge has like a milky sap or a milky latex. Beware the rare. So this is a nice little slogan I borrowed from the University of Guelph Arboretum, just to highlight some of the rare and endangered plants of Ontario's dry tallgrass prairie, which include the green milkweed, Illinois tick trefoil, and the field thistle. And pictured here is the Illinois tick trefoil, which historically was known from Kamoka, where it was collected in 1880, and before it was extirpated. And then recently, this species was rediscovered in the city of Brantford, growing along a public railway line. It was listed as extirpated in Ontario as a result, but pending the next status review by CSIWC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, it probably will be changed to endangered. There's currently only one population of Illinois tick trefoil known from Ontario, which, as I mentioned, is in the city of Brantford, along a city-owned rail trail. The other dominant type of tallgrass prairie in southern Ontario is moist tallgrass prairie, which is obviously the opposite of dry tallgrass prairie. So we think of prairies as occurring in very dry, hospitable environments, but they actually also occur in moist, but equally inhospitable environments, and we'll look at that a little bit closer. So moist tallgrass prairie is a bit of a unique ecosystem. It occurs wherever there is deep sands laid over clay and or along major rivers. So the association with rivers is largely because ice flows and flooding limit tree growth in these ecosystems, and therefore prairie grasslands can thrive right along the river's margin. However, the deep sands over clays occur in a very small and confined area in Ontario, which is called the Lake Plain of, it's a physiographic region, which is an area of a lake bed of a former glacial lake. So when the glacial lake shrunk, it left behind a lake bed which contained deep sands deposited over clay. And in these areas, you get what is called moist tallgrass prairie. So in the spring, when you get significant amount of precipitation and snowmelt, the water gets trapped in this clay lens, and actually the ecosystem can be inundated with water. And then as that water evaporates or percolates through the clay, you're left with a fairly dry, sandy prairie. So the plants that grow in this habitat are adapted to both flooding and drought conditions, which typically are not is not an ideal environment for trees to grow in. They typically like something a little bit more consistent, either dry or wet, but not both. And these occur in wet or moist prairie occurs in the Lake Plain area of southern Ontario in Elgin, Kent, Essex, Middlesex, and Lambton counties. So that's the deep southwest of Ontario, and also adjacent Walpole Island First Nation, which is unceded First Nation land west of Walsburg. And previously I mentioned rivers. So both the Maitland River and the Asable River in southern Ontario contain remnants of moist tallgrass prairie. Again, looking at the grasses, we got a couple different grasses that grow in moist tallgrass prairie. You will also get, a big blue stem and Indian grass growing in these as well. But typically, you'll start to see switchgrass pictured here with its very open and airy seed heads. Switchgrass is interesting because it will grow in dry soils such as Black Oak Savannah at Pine Ridge Provincial Park, as well as very moist soils, such as found in Lake Plain Prairie. And the other prairie grass species that you get in both riverine and Lake Plain Prairie is your prairie cordgrass. It's one of the tallest grasses in the ecosystem, and it's probably the one that gave rise to the historical accounts of grass higher than a horse's back. And it mainly occurs in those really low and wet areas and along riverine ecosystems. Interestingly enough, the name, the scientific name is derived from the Greek word pecten, or for the word comb, due to this comb-like appearance of the what's called an inflorescence or flower on the flowering branches. And here's a picture here of a cordgrass dominated ecosystem. It has very long and wispy seed heads. And if you're in the field, and the easiest way to tell if you're looking at the cordgrass versus maybe a similar looking sedge plant is to run your hands along the plant, but you want to do this very carefully, because the grass, much like rice cut grass, is very sharp and can open your hand if you rub it the wrong way. So you want to run your hand up the stem, but not down. The other common name of prairie cordgrass that the pioneers gave was ripgut, because the grass was known to open wounds on the stomachs of their horses if they rode through it. Lake Plain Prairie has some of the most beautiful and rare wildflowers we have in Southern Ontario, including tall ironweed, which has very unique deep purple to pink terminal clusters. This is a very tall plant, typically in the 1.5 to 2 meter range, and the name ironweed is in reference to the very strong and sturdy stems, which stand up very well in strong winds. Another rare and beautiful wildflower of the Lake Plain Prairie is the Prairie Dock. It has these large spade-shaped leaves at the bottom of the plant, and then long, naked flowering stalks, which can be 3 to 10 feet tall and have sort of these round daisy-like yellow flowers, which are, approximately 5 centimeters across. Another tall one, you do get a lot of tall prairie plants and grasses in this very moist and fertile environment, and this one is certainly one of the tallest. Similar in height to Prairie Dock is the tall sunflower, again ranging from 3 to 10 feet. It has this yellow flowers, which consists of 1 to 12 flower clusters, comprised of many smaller flowers contained within the center of the flower cluster. Giant sunflower is a good spreader because it does develop rhizomes and spreads underground vegetatively, as well as above ground via seed. Another beautiful yellow summer wildflower of the Lake Plain or moist prairie is the Greyheaded Coneflower. It has these drooping yellow rays which surround a grayish turning to brown disc flower. This one's on again. It's on the shorter side. It's only 1 to 2 meters tall. Next is Culvers Root, which is named in honor of Dr. Culver, who prescribed this plant as a very effective herbal laxative historically. Again, on the taller side, a half meter to 2 meters tall. And it's topped by what are described often as candelabra-like spikes of densely clustered small white flowers. And the leaves are narrow, oval, and dark green and arranged in a whorl around the stem. Lake Plain Prairie has no shortage of extremely rare species. Many of them, several of them are on the endangered species list, including colic root. Pink milkwort is endangered. Small white lady slipper is endangered. White fringed prairie orchid is threatened, I believe. And then equally rare are the purple milkweed, tall green milkweed, Sullivan's milkweed. We saw these already, Prairie Dock and Greyheaded Coneflower and tall ironweed, as well as the Culvers Root. And last but not least, and similar to tall sunflower in appearance, is the tall coreopsis. So Lake Plain Prairie in Ontario is home to many, kind of rare and unusual prairies and or prairie species. And if you ever get a chance to visit Walpole Island First Nation and tour some of their prairies, it's certainly world renowned as one of the best places in Eastern North America to see moist tallgrass prairie. Certainly the best, has the best shows of anywhere in Ontario. And probably second best would be Ojibwe Prairie in the city of Windsor, which is a provincial nature reserve and also home to a city operated nature center, which is excellent as well. So I encourage you to visit some of the public prairies of Southern Ontario, the ones found around us, closest to Brantford, as well as some of the Nature Conservancy properties in Eastern Ontario and the Rice Lake Plains, and some of the moist tallgrass prairie ecosystems in the city of Windsor. If you're interested in seeing some of these plants firsthand in their wild habitat. Last but not least, I just wanted to end my talk with a sort of closing reference to Oak Savannah and Oak Woodland, which I mentioned at the beginning, and this is an example of a black Oak Savannah pictured here. This is in the Chicago area actually, but is actually very similar to what we would have in Pinery Provincial Park. And so Oak Savannah is, and the similar Oak Woodland, the best place to see that in Southern Ontario is Pinery Provincial Park, where they do excellent restoration of the Oak Savannah and the Oak Woodland. I'm not going to get into it too much in this talk. Oak Savannah and Woodland are oak, hickory, and pine tree dominated canopies with a mixture of shrub thicket, tallgrass prairie, and open forest species. Interestingly, there are a few species which only occur in oak savannas and woodlands. They require that combination of oak canopy and open sunny conditions. Savannas and woodlands can be very diverse and interesting and often overlooked plant communities, which I think would probably require a whole other talk for you to really appreciate. So I'm not going to get into them too much today. That is the end of my talk on Ontario's tallgrass prairies, and I'm happy at this time to take any questions.
Thanks a lot, Graham. That was great. It's great photos and like all the reminders about what's rare and what's not and the ecology. We've got a few comments. If anybody has any more questions, keep adding them to the chat and we'll read them out. We had a question of someone wondered whether butterfly milkweed had hairy leaves and not smooth leaves. And I guess you had said the opposite.
My recollection is that I guess they might have small hairs. I think of them as smooth. The hairs might be small, so they could be right. I'm not sure. I'll have to check my plants this summer. I think of them as kind of smooth, but it would make sense that they're hairy because they're growing in a dry environment. So I may have got that wrong.
And then another question was, in the tallgrass prairie, what percentage of the plant life would be grass as opposed to the flowering plants?
I think it's around 70% in sort of a climax old growth tallgrass prairie. In a new planting, typically in a restoration type planting, you will have a higher mix of wildflower species, but oftentimes because the grasses are very long-lived and very excellent competitors, and with management with fire, you'll typically end up with a grass to forb mix around 70% grass to 30% wildflower.
Does the burning favor the grasses then over the forbs?
Yes, it does. So spring burning does, and in Ontario, we primarily in Ontario burn in the spring. It's the easiest time to burn, and it's also because you're dealing with a very dry, predictable fuel load. In other parts of tallgrass prairie range where you don't deal with suffocating humidity in the summer, you can have more success burning tallgrass prairies in the summer months as well, which, although hard on biodiversity, can actually is one way to manage your tallgrass prairie for wildflowers as opposed to grasses. So historically, when prairies were burned by First Nations at maybe different times of year, we may have had a different mix as well. Large herbivores such as eastern elk, which are gone from southern Ontario, probably played a significant role in the composition of prairies as well.
And someone is asking for the botanical name of the taller giant sunflower.
Helianthus gigantea.
And you had some pictures of liatris, but you didn't actually talk about them. Are there quite a few of them in the tallgrass prairie, or is it just the spicata?
Spicata is the primary one in moist tallgrass prairie. You will get Cylindricaceae, the cylindrical blazing star, in dry tallgrass prairie and Oak Savannah, Black Oak Savannah. So you will see cylindrical blazing star in Black Oak Savannah at Pinery Provincial Park and in dry tallgrass prairie in the Rice Lake Plains. And then there is a third and much rarer liatris, which is your button blazing star, Liatris aspera, which occurs in a few scattered dry prairie remnants in Windsor, as well as Black Oak Savannah at Pinery Provincial Park. So Liatris spicata, or dense blazing star, is the only one you get in moist tallgrass prairie.
So we've got a question about someone who's converting a septic bed, which is sand, to a dry prairie meadow. And they're asking if there's any advice on what main species of wildflowers should be included in the septic bed. So they don't have that much space, but they are on a monarch flight path and want to attract them specifically. So advice for dry prairie meadow as opposed to, I guess, the really tall one on a septic bed.
If I were you, and you want to get do a bit of research, if you have access to the internet, there's a company out of Minnesota, Prairie Moon. And the reason I point people to that website is because they have a very significant number of seed mixes, and they have a seed mix for almost every situation. And although I certainly don't encourage people to buy and import seeds from Minnesota, looking at their seed mixes would give you a pretty good, there's probably 2 or 3 seed mixes for short grass, tall grass prairie, as well as I think they may actually have a septic seed mix that you could look at for ideas. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay, thanks for that. And someone's asking who to contact with help for a tall grass prairie burn. Would that be Tallgrass Ontario?
I think you could you could contact Tallgrass Ontario. That's probably your easiest easiest way to do it. And they have an email address, which I think is info@tallgrassontario.org.
Who else would be doing burns? I assume you need someone who's certified.
Yeah, we as was mentioned in the preamble, the ministry through the stewardship program used to do private land burns, but that stewardship program ended. Now prescribed burning in Southern Ontario is done by a couple of contractors, either Lands and Forests Consulting or a company out of Norfolk County called Wildfire.
And then someone's on the topic of a Liatris. They're asking if the Liatris aspera was historically present in High Park in Toronto.
I'm not aware it was. It could have been. I am not sure. High Park is not an area I'm very familiar with. I have some familiarity with it, but not enough to know the plant species that occurred there and occur there that well.
There's a comment here, I presume it's about the fire, that said we just used Lands and Forests at Conservation Halton last week and it went very well. So that must have been a burn from Conservation Halton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very experienced organization. I've used them when I was doing large and more complex burns, such as at the Branchdon Prairie south of Cambridge, that I wasn't, sort of comfortable doing myself.
That helps. And then we've got someone's asking where is the best place to buy plants, and I'd say it used to be the nursery that Graham Buck ran, but now he doesn't run it anymore.
Yeah, well, I think there are a few plant nurseries in the area. I don't know if I'm gonna endorse one over the other, but I don't know if Judy, you have a list, or you'd want to list them out, or if I think Pollination Guelph has put out a list in the past of nurseries in the Guelph Wellington area.
So NAPS, which the North American Native Plant Society, does have a list that you can consult. Here in Guelph, there's actually Origin Native Plants that they're growing their plants out at St. Ignatius, and they have some tall grass plants on their website. A great place usually is the University of Guelph Arboretum plant sale, which they haven't had for the last couple of years because of all the construction, but that's going to resume again. And then a place that you can also get some tallgrass prairie plants is actually the Nature Guelph Wildflower Sale, because a number of the members do have small tallgrass prairie plants in their gardens, and they dig them up and put them out. This year, because of COVID, we didn't have the seed workshop for wildflower, but in most years when we have the seed workshop, we do include some tallgrass prairie plants if people want to try and grow their own. And I'd put a warning out. Everybody already owns a cup plant, and we always get lots and lots of them at the plant sale, and they're kind of spready. But if you don't already own a cup plant, you can always get one at the plant sale. And then Janet Harrison is reminding us that May 14th is the NAPS plant sale. So the NAPS plant sale, that's the North American Native Plant Society based out of Toronto. They have a plant sale every year at the Toronto Botanical Garden. They don't actually grow plants. They source plants from a half dozen or more of the native plant growers, including some of the wholesalers that you normally can't buy from, and they have them at their sale. And you can check the NAPS website, and they will have a list of what they have for sale. If someone's doing a really big buy, the St. William's Forest Nursery is a good source, but they are wholesale, so you have to buy a lot to buy from them. And if anyone else has got good ideas, there's so a lot things like butterfly milkweed. The smaller things are a lot of the native plant nurseries have. The really tall ones are a little harder to come by. So I'm seeing pretty much, I think, the end of the questions. Were there any more before we close off? So it sounds like, Graham, we're going to have to get you back to talk about the Savannah. Maybe next year.
Yeah, happy to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe next year.
And if the world ever goes back to normal, perhaps maybe someday we'll organize a trip to see some of these. So we're getting some thank yous in the chats, and I'm going to thank you too, Graham. And as always, wealth of knowledge and great on the all the questions and all the details. So for the rest of the people, Trees for Woolwich is establishing a tallgrass prairie out just outside of Elmira in a really interesting planting they're doing with about 5 different ecosystems there, including the Oak Savannah, and they're just starting that. So once that's up and running, we might take a tour out there. Last year we donated quite a few of the plants left over from our plant sale to that. So thanks a lot, Graham, and we'll hope to see everybody next month. And for those of you who are willing to donate plants to the plant sale, then please contact me. It's wildflower@natureguelph.ca with details about how to dig up plants and send them off. And I see that there's a plant inventory link has just gone up in the contents. So if someone wants to see that, you can see that just went up in the comments. So thank you all, and thanks, Graham, and we'll see you all next month. Bye-bye.